Not far from the village of Aguianis in Corfu, and on the way to Murtiotissa Beach, the beach we like the best, there was a small restaurant called Georgie Loves People. I know, a bit of a strange name for a restaurant, but the owner was a bit strange himself. He was eccentric, grey-haired, wiry, in his 50s, and he was called, yes, you guessed it, his name was George, or Yorgos, but most commonly referred to as Georgie Loves People. His food wasn't much to write home about, but he was more well known, I think, for his red wine. Definitely for his red wine, which he was constantly brewing in a big vat at the back of the restaurant. As soon as customers arrived, usually international backpackers, he'd plonk down a jug of red wine and say, "Welcome to Georgie Loves People! Drink up! Georgie Loves People!" Well, it cost next to nothing, but it didn't taste great. I guess you get what you pay for. Anyway, since none of us were exactly wine connoisseurs, maybe this was how Greek red wine was supposed to taste. It was slightly better than Retsina, the local white wine. But as one of the guys put it, it was really gut rot. Drinking only a couple of glasses would leave me with a terrible hangover, and I felt very sick the next day. This was true for most of the imbibers of the red wine. One of the guys from the hostel, Barry from New Jersey, said he'd seen Georgie remove a piece of rubber tubing from a vat of wine and use it to siphon petrol from his car to someone else's car. He then shook the tube free of any surplus petrol and placed it back into the vat of wine. So Georgie was very generous, but I'm wondering if he really did love people or whether he was trying to kill us with kindness. Anyway, after that, we all kind of refrained from drinking his red wine. One day I was walking to the beach with Liz, a Scottish girl, and we decided to stop for a cold drink at Georgie Loves People, which was roughly the halfway point between the village and the beach. When we were about a mile away from the restaurant, a motorbike carrying two young Greek men speeded into the back of us, and Liz, who was walking on the outside closer to the road, was thrown into the air. Ironically, I'd been walking on the outside just a minute previously, and for some reason, and call it fate, we'd swapped places. So I was unhurt, but Liz was unconscious and lying in a pool of blood. I heard screaming coming from somewhere, and it turned out to be two gypsy women who'd been hidden behind a bush at the side of the road and saw it happen. They were waving their arms up and down and were very distressed. Since they didn't speak English, I asked them with hand movements if they would stay with Liz while I went along to Georgie Loves People to call for an ambulance. I hated to leave Liz, but I didn't know what else to do. I'd only walked a little way when suddenly Georgie drove up in his old beat-up car. Apparently, the biker had stopped at his restaurant and told him what had happened, and Georgie had arrived to take Liz to the hospital. I'm sure it wasn't the wisest thing to move her into his car, but fortunately, by this time she was awake, and even though she was bleeding from her head, arms and knees, it seemed that there were no broken bones, because she was able to stand up. I think the gypsies must have cast a healing spell on Liz. At the small hospital in Corfu, she was diagnosed with concussion, cuts and bruises, of course. It was a depressing place, and Liz was very miserable for the 3 days she was there. She told me that they'd hardly paid any attention to her at all, although I'm not sure this was true. But when I visited her the next day after the accident, I saw that her nose was bleeding slightly. When I was able to find a nurse, she looked at Liz and then offered me a rough paper towel to wipe Liz's nose. Obviously, no Kleenex here. During the time she was in the hospital, I was going between the British consulate's office and the police to try and get some kind of compensation and accountability for the accident. The bike rider did pay Liz's hospital fees, so that was something. But the police didn't charge him with dangerous driving, which was very frustrating. Because her clothes had been ruined, I said they should give Liz something towards that, but no luck there. During this time, I was still working at the hostel restaurant mornings and evenings, so I got to know all the backpackers who came to the hostel. There were regularly maybe 10 to 20 travellers from all over the world, but mostly from the States, the UK and Canada, a couple from Australia and South Africa. It was normal for people to stay in the hostel for a couple of weeks because they really liked the village. So we all got to be like a little family. And I felt like the mother hen. As I mentioned previously, backpackers generally looked out for one another. We practically walked in one another's shoes and understood the trials and tribulations of travelling on a shoestring budget. I'd now been in Greece for 3 months and I needed to renew my visa for another 3 months. The only problem was that I would have to actually show the Greek authorities that I had enough money to stay in Greece for another 3 months. Well, I didn't. And since I wasn't ready to go home, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I was explaining my tale of woe to the 10 or so people sitting around outside the hostel. And without hesitation, first Morgan from California and then Bob from Michigan said, we could all pitch in and lend you the cash. Right, guys? Everyone agreed and asked me how much money I needed. I was flabbergasted and so touched that these strangers would be willing to help me. So the next day I was able to produce enough drachma and my one remaining traveller's cheque to qualify for another 3-month visa. As I returned the money to my family of travellers, I realised how, yet again, I'd experienced kindness and caring when it was least expected. These guys had my back. They trusted me, but I would have done the same for them. My need certainly wasn't a serious one, but it taught me to never underestimate the generosity of the human spirit. I do believe that people will reach out to others in times of crisis and to treat others the way we would want to be treated. The Hindu word of greeting, namaste, suddenly comes to mind, especially since I've just taken a yoga class. At the end of the class, we put our palms together and bow as we say with the teacher, namaste. This word conveys that the divine in me respectfully recognizes the divine in you. It's a feeling of spiritual oneness of heart and mind with another person. Wouldn't it be wonderful if this could be a proper greeting for us all? Because she was desperately unhappy and it appeared that she didn't have any serious injuries, Liz chose to leave the hospital and return to the hostel in Aguianis. She wasn't right, though, and obviously suffering with the effects of concussion. Her balance was off and she had difficulty moving her arms and legs, and she had dizzy spells. I was very concerned, and even though Liz had previously been sleeping in the garden, I managed to get a room in the hostel for both of us. I wanted to keep an eye on her. But after a few days, when she didn't seem to be improving, I encouraged her to go back to Scotland. A couple of days later, I put her on the ferry to Athens and asked that she write to me as soon as she was home and safe. I never heard from her, though, and I just have to trust that she was okay. Before I took the bus back to Aguianis, I decided to stop at the local sandal maker, Yorgos, of course. He was very popular with backpackers because he charged very little for making a pair of traditional Greek leather sandals and also provided complimentary ouzo, feta and olives. That day I happened to be wearing the purple and green striped kaftan that now only came to my knees, the back of it had been ripped off on the motorbike, remember? As far as I knew, the striped material was lying somewhere along the dusty road to the beach, trampled to shreds. When I entered Yorgos's shop, he threw up his hands in delight and pointed to me, and then back to the wall behind him, where I was astonished to see the remainder of my ripped kaftan hanging in pride of place. Next time, back to England and plans to emigrate to Canada. Thanks for listening.